the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about. And I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 127, where we're going to be taking a look at some of the biggest badasses in Shanghai history. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. You are part of an audience who are some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. People who make a real effort to perfect their craft. As we get ready to go through some of the baddest to the bone in a hardcore city, we're going to be looking at some bad guys, then some really bad guys, then some extraordinarily tough guys that take it to the limits to take care of the really bad guys, and this one guy who changes history, but he would fight for whoever just paid him. Before I get into the episode, let me say thank you to all of you who have been contacting me on different things. I've been working hard on putting together a schedule for the summer martial arts seminars that are coming up, and I appreciate your interest in the objective-based practical martial arts seminars that I've been putting together as well. It's my hope that Kung Fu Podcast becomes a hub for where martial arts research meets the martial arts practitioners, and you'll be able to find different types of material from different types of people on all of the important aspects of your martial arts. The core of this episode is based on an article by CNN.com where it talks about how historical renegades are almost always part of most cities' pasts. Shanghai during the late 1800s and early 1900s is easy to argue could have been the baddest of the bad around the globe and throughout modern history. So let's get ready to talk about some of the baddest of the bad.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Nobody now give you no break. Police now give you no break. That old soldier man now give you no break. Not even your eyes now give you no breaks. Well, hey, bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
A city doesn't get bad all by itself. There has to be some hardcore people there that turns it that way. At CNN.com, they write, quote, "Culturally and politically, few places have seen more dramatic shifts over the past 2 centuries than Shanghai. It has been a meeting place for international thoughts and ideas. A theater in which competing international interests played out with fascinating and often tragic consequences. But it has also been a city aflush with sex, drugs, and violence, ranking high on the list of historically badass cities. And this delicious debauchery is not the result of just 1 or 2 renegades. Shanghai has been run through with badasses throughout the ages, ranging from the hard-nosed to the certifiably insane. This list, in keeping with the city's cosmopolitan mystique, looks at 5 badasses from various nations and eras, each weaving his own thread in the city's rich, roguish tapestry." End quote. Well, Kung Fu Podcast is all about culture, adventure, and the impact of martial arts. And this episode will hit all 3. The culture of Shanghai during the late 1800s, early 1900s. The adventurous stories that legends are made of, and the impact they had on the city, the people there, and the nations involved. And then this thread of martial arts that runs through them. First on the list, the Green Gang. A bunch of gangsters. And at last count, they have been mentioned at least in 5 Kung Fu Podcast episodes. They were bad, and they were bold. The Green Gang was neck-deep in triads and secret societies, many of which that used martial arts and the physical nature of the training to help train their gangsters, and to be the storefront business to make their presence felt. They were opium smugglers. They were the murder and surgical assassination squad for Chiang Kai-shek. They had moles in every police station, and don't forget that part about having moles inside the police station, because we will have 2 other characters coming up here pretty soon who were associated with the police force and responsible for ferreting out those moles. One of the heads of this syndicate was Du Yongsheng. He was mean, he was bold, and he would warn you before you were going to be killed by delivering a coffin to your home. And his partner, well, he was just crazy, and reportedly fed his girlfriend to a tiger. There's a very good book titled The Shanghai Green Gang, Politics and Organized Crime, 1919 through 1937, authored by Brian Martin, where you get a detailed look of how Shanghai was riddled with crime, and that there were gangs from various places, and these gangs had various styles of practice with specialties. In many cases, the Green Gang was so bad that the law-abiding citizens would turn to the Green Gang for protection from these outlying specialty gangs. So basically, you're going to go hire the really bad guys to take care of just the scary guys because you don't know which of the good guys in your police force you can trust. Martin writes, quote, "The rootlessness of this city of immigrants was often reflected in its pattern of crime. As noted above, many of the criminal gangs were organized crime along native place lines, and in the 1920s, Shanghai's gangsters were drawn mainly from three localities, Ningbo, Shaoxing, and Subai. Many of these gangs specialized in particular types of criminal activities. Shaoxing gangs, for example, were feared for their kidnapping rings, while Subai's gangs had a penchant for armed robbery. Kidnapping and robbery, in fact, had become the two major crimes in Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. Chinese capitalists lived in constant fear of kidnapping. To lessen the risk to themselves and their families, they hired bodyguards and fortified their homes. They also sought the protection of those who either controlled or had influence with kidnapping gangs, such as local Green Gang bosses Huang Jinrong, Zhang Xiaolin, Gu Shuzhen, and Du Yunsheng. The provision of such protection was one early means by which these Green Gang bosses extended their networks among the city's bourgeois. The victims of kidnapping, however, were not confined to members of the bourgeois. A well-organized system of trafficking in children flourished in Shanghai under the control of Green Gang bosses. Trafficking in boys was referred to as lifting rocks, and that involving girls was called plucking mulberry leaves. Boys were normally sold to wealthy monasteries or as apprenticed to commercial interests in Guangdong and Southeast Asia, while girls usually were sold to brothels in North China or in ports along the China coast." End quote. Well, we know that the Green Gang was formed by many gangsters of diverse cultures and backgrounds. Many reports say that they were organized remnants of gangsters from different societies that were involved during the Boxer Rebellion, which we refer to many times here at Kung Fu Podcast, including episode number 43, the U.S. Marines and the Boxer Rebellion. Because of their diverse cultures and backgrounds, we can assume that there was not just one martial art that these gangsters practiced. However, a couple of styles did pop up, such as Tong Bei, and the fact that they did have a close relationship with at least one important martial arts style, Shaolin. We know that because one of the bodyguards from the gang leader Du, who we mentioned a few moments ago, was a Shaolin martial artist. There's also a future Kung Fu podcast that is slated to be researched in the recovery of Chinese secret treasures that was looted by the Japanese, and the head man was a karate master. He was responsible for developing a relationship with the Green Gang in Shanghai to make sure that this looted treasure, which had been identified by monks, made its way back to Japan and then later was secretly recovered. The number 2 guy on the list is a guy who you sometimes couldn't tell whether he was good or bad, but he got the job done. Chen Yi thrived on conflict and was known to go to extreme lengths in order to provoke confrontation. And just as a reminder, provoking confrontation is not one of the steps in good personal self-defense. And for Chen Yi, it turns out that his superiors didn't always agree that the ends outweighed the means. So if the Green Gang was the baddest of the bad boys, then the Shanghai enforcer Chen Yi was the badass that managed to silence them. Yi was a communist strongman and a brilliant military mind. He marched the Long March, he resisted the Japanese, and he led the Red Army victory at the Huai River. Chen Yi was the first communist mayor of Shanghai where he had eradicated prostitution, gambling, opium, and organized crime. However, Mao Zedong noticed how tough Chen Yi was as he eradicated crime, and that got him demoted. In the book New Fourth Army, Communist Resistance Along the Yangtze and the Wai, 1938 through 1941. It says on page 233, Buddhists, too, play their part in sustaining the communist resistance in central China, though more individually and less directly. Not all Buddhists who worked for the communists in the war were even aware at the time of the political identity of their collaborators. For example, Chao Pu-Chu, a lay Buddhist charity worker in Shanghai who helped 1,500 refugees to get to Huanan, learned only later that his collaborators in the camps were party members. It goes on to write, some of the members of Buddhist orders assisted the New Fourth Army on their own initiative, moved by patriotic fervor. Xu Song, a monk in Yangcheng, was arrested in 1937 for criticizing the inadequate nationalist resistance and was released only after answering a series of difficult questions about Buddhist doctrine to prove that he was really a monk and not a communist. Back in Yangcheng, he persuaded his fellow monks to offer to serve the resistance as paramedics, but their offer was turned down by the local authorities. When northward moving units of the New Fourth Army occupied Yangcheng in November 1940 after their successful junction with the 8th Route Army, Louis Shaoqi and Chen Yi personally called on Xu Song, who represented his fellow monks at the consultative conference organized by the communists in late 1940. Xu Song, the Buddhist monk, would later say, quote, "The New Fourth Army were the only people who actually encouraged me in my desire to resist the Japanese." They go on to write about how the Buddhists gave the New Fourth Army safe houses and choice intelligence that was gained through their confidential ties to high-placed people who had approached them for spiritual guidance. They describe how these monks, in their tradition of martial arts, acted as spies, go-betweens, and secret protectors. Chen Yi was one tough son of a gun, and he had to be in order to overcome the Green Gang. But the third on the list would have fought for either one. His name was Frederick Townsend Ward. He was wounded in battle over 15 times, and by everything I could tell, he wasn't a martial artist as in a specific style. He was mostly, by the age of 30, a mercenary. He lived between 1831 and 1862. He was described as a wiry, dark-haired American man who was about 5 foot 7 inches tall, with black shoulder-length hair, a black mustache, and imperial clothes. His dad was the captain of his ship, so he worked as a mate on many vessels, which gave him this kind of worldly education, including training as a filibuster. Filibustering is described as raising private mercenary armies and leading them into other countries to advance either their own or someone else's schemes, or those schemes of wealthy sponsors. And Ward was trained by the king of mercenary work, Mr. William Walker. It is said that without Ward's work, the Qing dynasty would have fallen 50 years prior. The Boxer Rebellion would have most likely been successful, carrying out its strategy of removing imperialist powers. Frederick Ward's resume includes pirate hunting in Asia, being a ranger in Mexico, along with the mercenary training we were just talking about, soldiering in the Crimea, being the savior of the Qing dynasty, and the group he led became known as the ever-victorious army, many of which were Chinese soldiers and martial arts practitioners. Frederick Ward did not participate necessarily directly in any traditional martial arts, but he was wounded in battle 15 times, including being shot in the face in one of the later battles, and he led and trained many martial arts practitioners. He was dead at the age of 31, and his stories and effect carried out for many years later. Fourth on the list is a Korean man named Young Bong-gil. we can tell how volatile and dangerous Shanghai was during these late 1800s, early 1900s. And several areas of Shanghai later became invaded by the Imperial Japanese Army. And this is when young Bangil made a commitment to fight. According to the reports, at the age of 20, he had organized a reading club and published several pamphlets. In 1930, after establishing 2 rural athletic associations for the nationalist movement, Yun went to China because of the Japanese takeovers in Shanghai. Yun was eventually executed at the age of 25 for fighting against the Japanese attempts to take over. Later, his remains were shipped back to Korea, where he had been recognized as a national symbol of leadership. The Global Leadership Award is given to people who have contributed to the development of society. The 4th Global Leadership Award was held at the Patriot Yun Bangil Memorial, with over 500 recipients and interested parties present. President Oh Hun-duk was awarded the greatest prize for playing a significant role in improving the value of Taekwondo and making social contributions with Taekwondo while working for the Ministry of National Defense and Kukkiwon. Yun Bangil fought with his heart and for what he believed was right. It was said about him, quote, "A young Korean patriot has accomplished something tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers could not do," end quote. And then lastly, number 5 on the list, William Fairbairn, that I have also outlined a complete podcast for. I became intrigued when I read about Fairbairn in my latest issue of Combat Corner. And you already know that I read a lot, I study a lot, and unfortunately, I'm not a fast learner, nor am I a fast reader. So I have to select very carefully where I spend my time. And one thing I always make sure is on my priority list each and every month is to read my issue of Combat Corner. Now, sometimes it's 2 to 3 weeks later, but I get it. And I want to say thank you to Ian Abernathy. Of all the badasses listed, this guy may have been the ace of spades. Former Royal Marine, 600, that's right, 600 recorded combat situations in his 33-year career on the Shanghai Municipal Police Force. He was the author of Defendu, Get Tough, and Shooting to Live. Fairbairn, along with a fellow officer, helped design a weapon that was used by British commandos in World War II called the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. He is quoted as saying, "Unarmed combat is what we enter when we have been foolish enough not to have a weapon, careless enough to lose our weapon, or unlucky enough to have broken our weapon." End quote. The stories about his martial arts, why he got involved, how he got his ass handed to him, and then enrolled in training. I'm going to share more with those about you in some upcoming episodes, but let's put it in a perspective here. At the same time that this was happening with Fairbairn in Shanghai, Al Capone was terrifying people in the United States. The Chicago police force was trained to help battle his brutal gang tactics. In fact, one of my favorite movies, The Untouchables with Sean Connery, is dedicated to this whole time and period. Well, as badass as you would have had to been to be a legit police officer in Chicago, you want to know that there was an exchange program between the Chicago Police Department and the Shanghai Police Department during this time, during the 1920s and 30s, where Fairbairn worked every day. I saw several reports that indicated many Chicago police officers did not want to go to Shanghai as part of this police exchange program because Shanghai was considered way too dangerous. It was better to stay home and to deal with Capone. So those are our 5 bad-to-the-bone people in a hardcore city. The Green Gang, Chen Yi, Frederick Townsend Ward, Young Bangil, and William Fairbairn. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 127, where we began looking at the culture of Shanghai during the late 1800s, early 1900s. We kept on by looking at some of the stories and the adventures that legends were made of, and the impact that martial arts had in each and every one of those stories. And we're going to expand off of them as we go along. Remember that if you'd like to find out more about some of the seminars I teach, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/seminars. I hope that you get out there and have an outstanding practice today, and I look forward to talking with you again next week.